Welcome back. What energy in the room for after lunch. People were concerned that you'd all fall off, but energy, such passion about this topic, right? About patience, about risk-benefit, about really helping those preferences guide things going forward. It was an exciting time. Your energy showed it. It's time to do a few reports. We'll do the same process, 2 to 3 tables. If the conversation naturally goes into the more moderated plenary discussion like we did last time, great. But the initial approach will be a table reports for 3 to 4 minutes. We have a couple follow-up questions for 2 to 3 minutes. And then we'll go into the next table to see the variety of how you all approach this very dynamic and important topic. It is a voluntary process for reporting out. Is there a table that particularly wanted to go forward, particularly one that did not get to go in the first session? Kevin really wants to go here for table 2. Is that correct? Why not? So, Kevin, you can come to the podium or you can do it from in place.
I'm going to do it from the table here because this is a table effort.
All right. And then Morgan's going to bring up table 2.
And so we really focus our discussion on 2 categories of gaps and had some thoughts about some things to do there. So the first category of gap we noted was that right now the emphasis is more on us eliciting preferences and choices on the back end after there's already a mature, completed development program and there are some choices available. And the thought of the group was that a lot of work that could be happening at the front end is not happening. And so that seemed like a gap. And we discussed a number of different things that might be considered to help move the pendulum a bit more toward the I think what was called bottom up in an earlier presentation. We had a suggestion of looking at NCATs and others who are doing this kind of work to help evaluate the value proposition to people of doing it at the front end. We talked about thinking of that value proposition of this work at the front end beyond the traditionally conceived ROI for drug developers. And we talked about different categories of that. And we also talked a little bit about the possibility of doing these types of studies in a pre-competitive space and what would be the situations where that would be more or less favorable for doing it in a pre-competitive space. That was the first gap that had to do with really not enough work happening at the front end. The second gap we noted was, there are likely important contextual effects for people's preferences and choices, and to reflect those, to study those well requires very large studies, the size studies that are not budgeted for these days. And so some of the things we talked about that are sort of complement some of our earlier recommendations to try to leverage research networks to get sample sizes required for those larger studies that would be sensitive to context, and to try to maybe get a pilot project or 2 to demonstrate what's needed to do that well, and then what do you get when you do that well? What is the value of being able to characterize the context effects with greater precision? And I'll pause there and ask my colleagues what I missed or was unclear about. Bill?
I think there's one side conversation that was really interesting was that distinction that was raised earlier between choice and preference, and that it's great to understand preference, but many Americans live in environments of constrained choice. And so in some ways, inquiring about preference might even be disingenuous because ultimately, given your social, cultural, economic environment, you might not be able to avail yourself of all those choices. And so really factoring that into this work as well.
And then did you push that on to where the solution might be, having identified those gaps, what one would want to do? You implied more needed to be done early. Did you have specific research agenda or scale up approaches?
Yeah, I mean, the suggestions we had the problem with it not being done early enough was that those who could be doing it early enough often don't see the value or are having difficulty making the value argument to get the budget up front. And so we talked about ways of trying to collect information through, say, NIH research networks and to do studies to help evaluate the value proposition to to demonstrate. Well, I was saying evaluate because we don't. I'm just being a good scientist. It's an hypothesis. So I'm sorry, Brett. I'm sure it will work, Brett. But let's just and also to consider in making the value proposition at the front end, to consider all the different kinds of return on investment someone might experience as a result of that, beyond the traditionally conceived return on investment.
This seems to relate to some of the first session where we talked about evaluating the impact of all the patient input as well, right? This seems to be a corollary. Kevin, any other comments back? So we have Kevin in the queue. Turn your cards up. Oh, you have one more comment here from the table. So Kevin, hold on.
I think that there's also the ability to evaluate whether preferences matter by looking at products that have been evolved because of patient input. So we had a conversation on long-acting antiretroviral therapies, right? So, or different types of modes of administration that companies have invested in their existing pipelines and existing marketed products. And when you look at the market share of those, whether they've actually achieved some market share, that's also a really important signal that doesn't require an RCT. You're seeing actually the patients choosing these other modes of administration or sites of service.
Excellent. All right. I didn't mean to interrupt table 2. Our presentation complete? All right. Kevin, response, and then John in the back. Oh, table volunteering. All right. That'll be great.
So can I?
Please.
Okay.
Thank
I
you,
just
Kevin.
completely agree with you, Kevin. I think that's the paradigm change, is the whole part about value proposition. And my experience is that people aren't thinking that way, but they have to think way, because that's where the market is going. So dead on with that.
Excellent. Any other responses to that from the room? Otherwise, we'll go on to the next volunteer. I don't see hands up. Bill has a hand up.
I'm just going to say
And
real quickly.
please identify yourself.
Oh, Bill Riley, NIH. I'm just going to say real quickly that one of the things that we discussed at this table that's related to this, Kevin, was that we were thinking through all the large cohort studies of various types and whether there's any of this patient preference questions data in there. And our sense is very little to none. And whether once there's a value proposition that's been evaluated, not demonstrated, and we've determined what that is, that we could maybe actually begin to think about putting some of these patient preference questions in some of those larger cohort efforts.
Excellent. Good piece. And there was a good recommendation as well, not just seeing it, but then how would that translate into a research recommendation that would have scale. Wonderful demonstration. So, John, your table 6 wanted to go. Were you volunteering to be the spokesperson as well, or someone else?
I got thrown in.
Voluntold.
Our group focused on the question of how do we better understand preferences for benefit risk from the patient's point of view. We noted, as the last group did, that there is this difference between what people make as choices and this kind of latent concept of preferences, but we also demarcated the utility of this in terms of using preference research to make population generalizations, but then also some instances where we need to make preference judgments at the individual patient clinician decision, such as in shared decision making. And we were thinking that really some of the methods that we do are not perfect for doing it at the population level and not perfect to doing the individual patient decision-making level, but there were many different questions, and we endorsed this concept that was raised earlier on, that the different settings and the different context implied upon which level that you wanted to do that at. How did you want to get closer to the individual patient level, or did you want to get closer to the individual population level, knowing that you'd never be able to perfectly reach each of those ideals, but on the context of that. We had an interesting discussion about the barriers of doing this. rather than focus on a couple of case studies, we drew some parallels to some other areas of research, such as the Promise Initiative and other efforts that have had large investments. And so we were thinking that maybe something in the order of $1 billion needed to be spent on this, because there are fundamental gaps in the basic sciences. In my estimation, based on, the work that I've done, Brett's done, Reed Johnson, others, we've really only done about $50 to $100 million worth of research on this in the last 15 years. That's not much. To say I'm an expert on this topic, or Brett is an expert on this topic, relative expert. We haven't done that.
Well, Brett, isn't it nice to be in that sort of category? Out of everyone in the room, he picked
to give you a very concrete example, I have presented work at the FDA, and they go, how generalizable is this? And I go, I don't know. I've never done a really big study. We've done really big epidemiological studies. We've done even really big clinical trials, but we've never really done a preferences study larger than 2,000. Despite being a world's expert or a nation's expert on this, no one has ever funded the research, and I pretty much know every study that's in the area, and no one's gone there. So that's one area. We need more basic research in this area. We also need more researchers. I've been on this. Luckily, I have cloned myself successfully and sent some people off into the world, but not enough. We're not at a crisis point. We're seeing some people move over to this field from other disciplines, which is great, but we still have a staffing issue. We have a staffing issue in doing this research. We have a staffing issue in facilitating this research. We have a staffing issue in interpreting this. So staffing the field is an important barrier. But also in this area, there is one last barrier that needs to be addressed, and that is, once we have all of these things, much more research, centers of excellence, lots of staff, we need a forum for these people to communicate with one another. And we don't, so I've heard here some people say, there's nothing going on, there's something going on, but we need better ways to communicate. ISPOR, for example, has done some great work in disseminating good research practices. That's one role in that, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And so what forum is there to provide this? We took the parallel to the field of cost effectiveness analysis. That is a well-established field, but in the United Kingdom, that field was started in 1972 with a funding to York University and to the Office of Health Economics. It took them 30 years of basic science before NICE was created. And so we need to make a large investment. If we're going to have preference research have a role, we need to make a large investment to make this happen. Others have indicated the success of this. We've seen PCORI have success in kind of changing the paradigm in certain areas, but
John,
we need to make an investment in this.
Time about up. Is there another point or two, or is that about it?
Once you ask for $1 billion, I think...
Yeah. I was trying to have you not bury the lead, right? $1 billion. Now, you all laugh at $1 billion, but we spend, well, there was chuckles in the room, but let's call that laughter of affirmation then, right? That, Jennifer, quick response.
I have a really quick question. If you could do a very, very large preference study, what would that look like?
I think that we need to start having instruments that can be used time and time again. Most of my work is one and done. I'll spend $100,000 designing an instrument, $100,000 implementing an instrument, $100,000 disseminating, then I throw that instrument away. I think there are some avenues that we have to reuse, repurpose. I think having a preference data bank, for example, for cancer adverse events. We have now PRO instruments. The work of Ethan Bash has revolutionized how we've done PROs for cancer adverse events, but we don't have a value set for them. That's an avenue to do it. But, Ethan got multiple RO1s and a NIH consortium and linkages to the promise to get that off the road. We haven't had a big investment like that's disease-wide yet. And I think that's because most of our funding comes from patient organizations that are narrowly focused, industry that are focused on a single molecule. There is some effort, but we're in a tragedy de commons. We heard earlier, all rising together. I think we need central action to be able to afford to do that study.
Real opportunity for collaborative effort, it sounds like. Joey, you want to build on this?
Yeah, Joey Mattingly, University of Maryland. Maybe this is a question for Brett or John as well. Is it possible that we can gain some efficiencies or pull from other industries or areas that have maybe done a good job of because I feel like when I go into Vegas, they know my risk profile pretty well. Well, I mean, they're really good at it. And then if you meet with a financial planner, they're really good at working with you to figure out. Now, I don't know if it's transferable, and that's like, I don't know, but is it possible that we could gain some efficiencies by taking from what we've seen in the financial sector, or what we've seen, Steve Wynn do, or whatever? So, anyway, open either one.
Yeah, let's not talk about Steve Wynn. I'm from Massachusetts. He just lost his name. Yeah, Steve's not a good role model here. But yes, a great point. Rick?
This is Dick Wilkie. It's where I thought you were going, and it's a related point, is the basic research should lead not only to the research that leads to the approval of, the population level benefit risk of products, but then to the individual elicitation and diagnosis of preference for use, just like Las Vegas does, so that the patients get the right thing that matches their own risk tolerance.
So I'm hearing themes of collaboration, of a fragmented field where you'd like to see more dissemination that's unified. Brett?
So I think Dick summed it up really nicely, and I think that gets to the question of what this large-scale study needs to look at. And I think they go to the point of we have a lot of consistent objectives, I should say not inconsistent objectives. There are multiple objectives, but they're not inconsistent with one another, that really get down to, as John was suggesting, we need to do some basic research in the properties of patient preferences and the development of tools to elicit patient preferences that can be used, generalized to a population, as well as to the individual decision in the necessary context of the healthcare delivery. And that will then provide those who make decisions to fund these studies in drug development in the private sector to say we have tools to use that someone else has taken the time to assure us are good tools that can then go through the product life cycle so that when they get to the review by FDA and they have to make a decision, or by an HTA body and they have to make a decision, much like the QALY is in health technology assessment in single payer systems, we have something similar, at least, in which everyone has confidence. And like I said, there are multiple objectives in developing this, but it goes back to the basic science, and those objectives are not inconsistent. So designing that research is going to be a challenge, but I think the direction for me is much clearer now than it was an hour ago.
Okay, so we got a couple people coming in, but just educate me for a moment, since I come from the biomarker space and the genomic space. We all have desires for biomarkers, but each one needs to be validated on its own. What I'm hearing you say is you believe there are some core set of questions that can be validated and reused disease state to disease state, situation to situation, unlike my biomarker world where every one is a completely different, more one and done. Is that the philosophy of this big experiment, or am I just missing it?
Just quickly,
and don't
partially
me
so.
Unless you all know this, and it's just me being a guy
no.
outside,
I think it's a very good.
I
think it's a very good point. The biomarkers, any measure itself needs to be validated. The applicability of that measure
is, may be limited to certain situations. So it may not be a single set of questions, but it may be an oncology model.
And I wasn't looking for, I was just trying to clarify the proposal that it was a big set of questions. Now, Hildy and a couple others said questions. So quick clarification here.
So think about this, though, instead of each individual biomarker, what they're talking about is essentially the same machine that you're going to use. So think about like Affymetrix chip 144 or something like that. But you're going to use that to do a whole bunch of different types of biomarker studies.
Okay.
They're talking about the machine.
All right, I just want to make sure that all of you are clear. You don't have to educate me. I'm not the reason that you're here. All right. But I just wanted to bring it up to make sure that you were all talking the same way and not talking crosswise with each other. And you all seem to be in consensus. So Hildy, and then Luther, and Mary was there actually before Luther. So Hildy, Mary, Luther. Who else needs to jump in on this? And Tony. And then back here to Laura. And don't worry about educating me. It's about you understanding and talking amongst each other for the right recommendations. Hildy.
Yeah, so I think this is a critical point that we do need validated patient preference measurement tools. I think that a lot of people in this room and outside of this room have developed patient preference questionnaires, et cetera, that they have put a lot of rigor in individually to make sure that they're asking the right questions to validate their tools. But the science of doing that, I think, is not shared. Just like we have basic quality of life measurement tools, there's now a new financial toxicity measurement tool. Some of them, they are basic tools that have been accepted to report on quality of life and PRO data within your clinical trial set, and it would be fantastic if we had the equivalent on patient preferences. So we really need something like this that can be used across diseases. Some of the quality of life tools have been adapted for specific diseases, but they're based on a standard that has been accepted.
Right. So a supporting comment for the big approach. Mary, and then Luther, and then John, will let you get some counterpoint after you hear a few more. All right, Mary?
Mary Tobin Akers. There's one of the things I noticed that we talked about very early on that I have found is perhaps a barrier, and that is we talk about patients and then we talk about stakeholders. And so stakeholders are putting together patient preference information, whatever. And maybe it's because ACRES is an alliance of multiple stakeholders across the research endeavor. I think we need to start thinking about stakeholders on an even basis. So patients are a stakeholder just as a sponsor is a stakeholder, just as an IRB is. And the interests of all of them are important. And so I think when we try to put together information on patients, it needs to have input from all the stakeholders together to be able to address everybody's interests. And it seems like that's what we're missing is, one stakeholder will go after patient information from their perspective and then from another. And I just think that's a cautionary.
Excellent point. That's a main focus of what we do at the MIT Newdig Center is bringing all those together. We have a saying in that context around drug development, not patient preferences, of patients first but nobody last, right? You have to consider everybody simultaneously. Patients always first. So I have an order of Luther and Rachel, and then I had Arthur, Laura, and then back to, is it Carlin? Is that correct? Sure. Carlin, thank you.
Right. So Luther Clark, Merck. My question actually builds on the point that Joey was making, and it's a potential research issue. And the question is, are there any tools from other industries that could be widely adapted to evaluate patient preferences? For example, Netflix knows what movies I want to see. Google knows what searches I would like to find. So you just put in one letter and the things that you'd like to know pop up. I mean, but are there these tools that already exist, particularly as it relates to digital or other technologies that can be applied to what we're trying to do here rather than trying to
So,
scale up.
Luther, rather than having the whole group answer you right now, may we put that forward as a possible research agenda that part of the research would be to go outside the healthcare field and really survey and explore those kind of tools and translate them back into this space? Would that be okay? Or were you hoping for an answer right now from the group?
It was a research question.
Thank you.
Unless someone knows the answer already.
All right, excellent. So let's move here.
Hi, Rachel Florence, National Evaluation System for Health Technology. I work closely with CDRH at FDA to improve evidence generation around medical devices. Prior to that, I was at PCORI, so I worked a lot with sort of the patient engagement perspective at PCORI. One thing so I'm not an expert in the science of patient input, but one thing that is striking to me is that certainly in the medical device area that I'm working in now, we really have a dearth of data on how the devices are performing clinically in the real-world population. So there's still a lot of work to do sort of in the bigger context around even being able to identify sort of outcomes for patients, both on the safety side and on the clinical side, that would then inform the kind of work that John and Brett are doing. So I think placing this in the context of, all is not rosy on the sort of larger context of sort of where evidence is. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a huge promise, of course, with the sort of the digitization of health records and claims records, sort of being able to link all of that longitudinally and really being able to sort of, faster, better, cheaper, do better evidence generation studies for a number of types of devices, but I think, and drugs probably. But I'd say let's put sort of the conversation today in the wider context of we're really still not doing that great at generating the right evidence, whether it's on the patient side or on sort of the clinical side, and for all stakeholders, for the regulators, for the payers, for the health systems, clinicians, and patients.
So we want a research program that will leapfrog the status of everyone else, and we'll be the beacon for all
Well,
those
possibly,
clinical
but I
trials.
think just connecting the dots and not sort of having just a focused conversation around sort of patient input, but also thinking about we're really still not doing that great generally, and how can all of that together be moved forward.
So that's a great research area of the science of patient input in the context of the larger set of input that regulators, sponsors, payers, HTA groups, et cetera, all need to consider and how it will play. So I have Arthur Laura Carlin in the queue. Is that correct? And John is sort of final word to come back. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Hi, Arthur Stone. Just the two experts that were going back and forth, I'm assuming that what comes out of this meeting is going to be, a push for a research agenda and hopefully a weighty one and will have an impact. But I heard you guys saying different things. I heard one of you saying that we need to take stuff and do large-scale studies to show the generalizability, but then I heard you say you want basic research in order to develop instruments, perhaps generic instruments, and these seem to be very, very different approaches. What do you want to see in this report?
Well, they want two $1 billion programs.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Sure.
Why
Well,
pick today? This
if we
is
do
not our
that,
job to
this
pick, but
report
we do
isn't
need
going to
to
have
be
much
clear.
impact.
Right. So again, our role is not to pick, but we do need to be clear. And if there are different ideas and concepts, we need to be clear that they are actually distinct so that they don't get muddled as they go forward. Okay? So are you asking for some clarification or confirmation from people here, Arthur?
Think about because they do seem very different.
Okay. So do people agree that they're different? Yes? Okay, so the record will show that when the people transcribe it, and we don't have to re-summarize it here. Laura.
So 2 quick points that are pretty related.
Arthur, put your name tag.
So Laura Lee Johnson at FDA. And I think when you're thinking about this, we talk about tools being agnostic. So if you're calling back to PROMIS and other places like that. So one of the issues with the PRO-CTCAE, and it was actually Bryce Reeve was at the NCI at the time who conceived that and allowed the funding to happen. Thinking about that, though, it was developed for cancer. And so why was that not true for why was it not disease agnostic? And sometimes these things come from funding sources and such, but also think about your decision body being semi-agnostic if you can do that. The idea of why do you need to do a separate study for an HTA versus different regulatory bodies versus all these other groups and stakeholders. So how agnostic can you make this? But I think when we challenge ourselves to do that, a lot of times the data collected and the way it's done many times can be very similar, but the data use and reuse and the research questions from that may be different.
Well said. Thank you. Anyone have a quick follow-up to that, or we'll go on to Carlin? Teresa? No?
So I think that to follow up on Laura Lee's point, and actually I would go back, I really appreciated Brett's slides, because I think what we're doing is kind of moving around in the space that he said. First of all, preference. We're using preference in many ways here. We're using it loosely and in many different ways. And his last slide I much appreciated, which is decision context for these things. And it's really going to shape what's the decision and what's the stakes. I mean, so a one-size-fits-all tool will have real trouble if we're going to compare the decision people are making when they have, they're trying to decide what drug to take. Well, as FDA can tell you, there's no drug that doesn't have risks, okay? So it's not like choosing a movie that you might, okay, maybe you, sorry that you picked that movie, but you know, or even you're sorry you picked that stock. But I mean, it's not going to be, the adverse effects are not going to be quite as much felt. And often where people do these studies, there's pretty bad stuff that you're trying to trade off. I mean, there's very serious risks. We're not talking about doing this where it's kind of not a big consequence, even for for drugs, right?
If I'm 30% wrong, who cares, right? On Netflix, I got.
So just to say that I don't know whether a one-size-fits-all, very simply, thought of, conceived, really would work and still give the decision maker, because at the end of the day, we are trying to inform something, what they need, and it's a good use of the time and the patients who are participating.
So I'm hearing that you're talking about, you have to understand the context of use, the decision maker or the context, right? And that the instruments have to be appropriate for that style of decision. Some are more rigorous and some aren't. That was some of our presentation as well, that earlier stage sort of work is a different level of rigor than late stage regulatory work, for instance. I'm trying very hard not to say the fit for purpose phrase, but there's some of that flavor that I'm sort of hearing in this. Am I hearing correctly from the room that there's some of that? Well, some people love that phrase and some people think it's overused, and I don't know what your use of context is here, so I don't want to transfer a phrase that may not be appropriate, right, through that. Carlin, but Tanisha, you wanted to jump in with a quick... Can you use the microphone and introduce yourself for the transcriber?
I wanted to build off a comment, Teresa, your comment, but also something Brett said, and our table had a conversation about whether this kind of work really is in the pre-competitive domain, right? And Brett's comment to us was it kind of straddles, because in some ways it's been traditionally viewed as very proprietary, but on the other hand, when you're doing a patient preference study on something like the management of end-stage renal disease and your preference for dialysis, that may be something that should live in the public domain, because there's many more innovators in that space that would benefit from it. So I do think that this idea of generalizable versus individualistic approach also has to be seen in the context of the idea of what is appropriate in terms of pre-competitive and not.
And if you have some generalizable instruments or tools, those can be used in both public and proprietary ways,
right,
but you're still using the same tools.
Or if I'm a company that is committed to diabetes or HIV, part of my public service may be to put some of that in the public domain, because it does and should reflect actual real-world patient preferences in care delivery. And I think that's an important component to bring forward. A lot of what we're talking about in drug development is actually the same set of questions that people at the end of the spectrum, once drugs are approved, still have the same set of questions.
Carlin, Katie would like to come in really quickly. Is that okay with you that we go? All right, Katie?
If yours is on this topic, okay.
And Katie, can you find a microphone and speak into it? And then Lana, you also want to go?
Katie O'Callahan, FDA. It occurs to me that to increase the utility for some of these situations that we're talking about, you need not just to have done the study, but to have created a decision aid tool, which in the obesity work was a separate step that was added onto the research. So one recommendation might be for funders that are looking to have an impact either pre-competitively or broadly across an area and not for a specific business decision case, that you think about adding that into the expectations of the research, that the decision tool be one of the deliverables that come out with a key focus on what is that end use and the decision maker and the decision context then gets built into the deliverables and the outputs of the research.
Excellent. Lana? And then we'll come back to Carl.
Would hope that as
and
we're
Lana, for the transcriber, we need you to.
As we're talking about this research agenda, that we don't stay old-fashioned and we start to think about the role of AI. The world is talking about artificial intelligence replacing human decision-making, and this seems like an area that would be ripe for starting to look at understanding human decision-making a whole lot better, taking in vast amounts of data and raising new hypotheses. So I just hope when we set an agenda, we at least use that as an area of endeavor, because that field is moving in medicine very quickly, and I think the behavioral aspects of it are probably not moving as fast as the so-called medical reading X-rays and those sorts of things.
So one could imagine a number of research studies that are as much descriptive and not even trying to do a normative sort of choice.
Exactly.
Is that correct? Jennifer, do you want to follow up? And Carlin is still waiting really patiently, so make it right on point. Okay.
Two really quick points. So kind of following up on the AI portion. So we're doing a lot more machine learning than I would say AI, but also going back to Luther's point in terms of can we already start seeing the preference, and we already are kind of doing that. So we look at claims data, we look at behavior data, and we look at when people are turning off of specific medications or specific interventions. And just a little bit more about evidation in general, we actually have 2.5 million people already connected, and a lot of what we do is we actually go out to them and survey them and ask them questions, and we have them, a direct connection to them, and it's bidirectional. So we actually go back and follow up with more questions to clarify what's going on. So, not committing that we're going to do this, but coming out of this, if we identify a set of questions, whether it's, basic research questions or something where we want to start to generalize, we can actually go and survey that population to ask them a lot of these questions.
Very, very good. So you haven't said very much, Pamela, so do you want to jump in? And then we've got Carlin and Jessica and Kevin in the queue.
We've got a lot going on this table.
Make the whole thing possible.
Sorry, Pam Tenart City.
Press the red button, please. Thank you.
Pam Tenart City. Ooh, okay. So what I would like to say about AI and machine learning, I think those are really good approaches, but I've heard more and more about sort of the black box around that. And if this field is going to move and using some of that with patient preferences, I think all these algorithms need to be in the open space and open access. And I think that can now be proprietary so that everyone knows how those decisions eventually come out at the other end of the black box, because there's a lot of bad things that can happen. And I think in this space, we probably don't want that. And if we're going to be newer at this, then let's just make a commitment to all have that in the open access space and available for people to look at.
So that goes to Cindy's, what's the standard you might propose in this space as opposed to a research program? Carlin?
It's okay, I'll circle back to it later.
You're sure? All right, so we've got Jessica, Kevin, and John.
That book is really making an impression.
Yeah, I think I fully support the transparency around the methodology and what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Is your mic on?
Yeah. Okay. I fully support that, the transparency around what we're doing, how we do it. There's no black box. It's really important. I just want to reiterate that the machine learning and artificial intelligence, the more we get this big data and large amounts of data is going to become critical. And a stakeholder that we really haven't mentioned a lot that really we need to partner with in this is the data scientists.
Mm. Well said. Okay, Kevin, John, and then Carlin, you may get the last word. We have a break at 2 o'clock, just so everyone knows what we're shooting for.
So let's just share, this is a recent experience. This was at a meeting called Kidney Next, and it's about, they're bringing innovation to the area of kidney disease. And there was actually someone that spoke, this was at the Broad Institute, and the person who's director there spoke, and he said, I just want to give you one lesson from oncology in the 80s. Biggest concern is that you guys are not going to talk to each other. And my biggest concern that I see here, and I'm seeing this in kidney disease, is there's all this activity, how much duplication, but who's really kind of organizing this, and who's going to be the communication area. That's my biggest concern here, leaving this meeting.
And from complex adaptive systems, you don't have to have a centralized hierarchical organization, but it does need to be a collaborative sort of organization, right? Through everything. Very good. John, you've been really patient. You've heard all this stuff. How would you like to synthesize it all?
I think what we have to bring it back to is, how do others do this? And, if we were sitting here and talking about a healthcare, an individual condition or a field or astrophysics or something like this, if it was another form of science, there's some kind of basic building blocks. We need taxonomies. We have seen some starts of taxonomies, but they are not universally accepted. Many people at ISPOR still think that I'm a PRO expert, despite having trained, a thousand.
No, let's not make this personal.
Okay, but a taxonomy, so we're talking the same things. Natural history or broader studies, epidemiological types of studies, so we know how preferences generally behave or something like that. We need centers of excellence. We need to train people. Beyond centers of excellence, you then need multi-centered studies. There are 2 academic centers or 3 academic centers maybe that could be involved in academic partnerships. I've had partnerships with both of them. There are some industry. We don't have really enough capacity to do those. These are the types of building blocks that other sciences use. I think if we're going to say we're going to rely on the science of patient engagement, then we have to build a community of scientists that do this work and bring them together.
And also have the scope so you can do replication in many different environments. And not just a few
absolutely. And I don't think that this is like making a single PRO instrument. Some PRO instruments like the SF6 and others, Euroqual, have been beneficial. But as Teresa said, many different things are at play here. These sometimes have to be customized. They sometimes have to be generalized. I almost think that this parallels the notion of genomics or proteomics. These are broad. These are big, complex systems that we know less than 1% about. People say why
behavior and preferences is so much easier.
But these things are measurable. This is a scientific endeavor. It is a noble science to go after. We need to create the field, and there seems to be a lot of interest in this. But there's so many people who one would say that's a preference researcher, or that person knows about the science of patient engagement. We're still a small group of practitioners, and it needs to be. We need to have coordinated effort, and we need central government action to be able to do this as a national imperative.
And some formalization. I hear you talking about standards and formalization and taxonomy, scale, and then really doing the actual science of the methods itself. Carlin, we're going to run out of time if you don't jump in soon.
No, I think my thoughts will hold in better to the next session now, so I'll actually just hold it.
Okay, so you're going to hold on for the next session. We have about 7 minutes left in this. Some of you have been very quiet all day. I'd like to invite anyone who hasn't felt they've made a comment yet. Is there a comment? Or we'll go into a rapid lightning round of truly 30 seconds apiece, final research program suggestions before we break. But first.
Yeah. Hi, Andrew Robertson, Sanofi. I just wanted to go back, since we do have time and I have the opportunity to comment, going back to the whole point of looking at the return on investment and value proposition. And it was an interesting exchange between the word to demonstrate versus evaluate. And I think this is one of the points we had at our table. If we do get to this point where we actually look to demonstrate the value, and for whatever reason is not where we think it should be, but we in this room, I think, can at least attest that there's a significant amount of importance in getting this information. We can then look to policy proposals to actually make up that gap. And I think that's something we should keep in mind. And we've seen this done in rare disease space. We've seen this done in pediatrics and a lot of other areas. This is something else that we might be able to do to bridge that gap, to actually build in the incentives that we need that might be lacking.
And can you suggest or name a couple of?
Sure. I mean, it could be anything from specific grants, and this is something that we've been talking about, to other more creative policy ideas like exclusivity, proprietary labeling. I mean, the list is good. There's a significant amount of options. What might be most appropriate for this, I think, needs to be further investigated. But we don't have to just say, well, we've looked at this, we're lacking, there's opportunities to actually build up.
Right. So that'd be research into the actual most effective policy incentives to advance the field to do the sorts of things that the group has been talking about today. And Tanisha, could you turn off your microphone so we don't get feedback by mistake? Thank you. Anyone else have comments, particularly those of you who have been quiet? Anyone else? Lightning, yes, please, Donna. I'm sorry, I didn't see your card. It's right underneath me. And Rick, did you have one in the back? Thanks.
If I had the opportunity to express a patient preference for $1 million funding and endowment of academic centers to come up with a taxonomy, and a $1 billion investment fund to promote AI, machine learning, and innovation in developing this type of patient preference and personalization research, I know where I would come down. So while
could you just be clear where you would come down?
I would come down on the innovation and disruptive AI version of this that moves at the speed of patient need. I feel that urgency, and so the 30 years of getting to NICE is more of a cautionary tale than a model to follow, I feel. So while I think we want to get to a level of rigor and a level of scientific credibility, I think the pathway to that, I think we really need to be careful in what we are proposing and setting up. Are we building, edifices that are disguised as infrastructure, or are we really designing, the best highway that will speed us to solutions?
Well said. So, Nicholas, you haven't said much. You're going to go first, and we got Rick in the background. And Andrew, you've made your point, or you had a second point to come through? Okay. And then Brett, perhaps, at the end. Did I miss something over here? Over here. And then Bill. So we'll go Nick, Bill, who hasn't said anything. We'll go back to Dick and finish with Brett. Okay? Thank you.
So Nicholas Brook from PFMD. So I'm not sure where my comment fits in within the organization of the workshop, but what I'm missing is that we talk about individual or fragmented approach to patient engagement. And I think if we need to ask what are the research questions moving forward is how we streamline all of that into something efficient and that doesn't put a burden on the patient and patient organizations. And so I'm not sure where it fits, but we are missing that part. And I heard the word systematic, and I will talk about the organization I know, PFMD, and we have taken a systematic approach to patient engagement. And so we have created Synapse, a database that organizes more than 250 initiatives about patient engagement and organize them in terms of experience of the patient, expertise of the patient, type of activity, type of engagement, and we also have listed more than 150 type of activities you can do with patients. So all this data exists at our end. We have developed a guidance for quality patient engagement, but this data is available for everybody for other type of analysis and other development. As an example, we are informing the new IMI Paradigm project, which will develop some of the methodologies we discussed today. So I think there is all this substance there, and how we link all of this to be efficient all together is very important, and I have not heard that today.
Wonderful point, and thank you for bringing in the IMI and the international coordination with that. Bill, we're running out a little time, and I keep missing Laura here at the end. So Laura will actually get the last word after Brett. So Bill, you're up. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to confuse you.
So I haven't heard much about sort of informed versus uninformed preferences. And we live here in D.C. where most of them are fairly uninformed. So
we said we're keeping politics out of the room. that was a generic comment, right?
Exactly.
But
it seems to me as we discuss these issues about how we determine patient preferences, that sort of degree of how informed those preferences are, what kind of information they're working from, that sort of thing is pretty critical.
Thank you, Bill. Dick, you're up.
So this comes from somebody who hasn't really done this work but has been an interested observer for a long time. If I were going to design a research agenda and fund part of it would be in the real world space with payers and in a clinic where patients are making choices every day based on not only their own preferences but on their constraints and the copays and the step edits and all that. It'd be really interesting to see some work done, and maybe some of it's been already done, but this is this is the real world where patients are making choices, and they probably should be making, we should be studying how they make those choices under the constraints they feel every day. And that
so
includes
this choice versus preference and what's
well, so you sort of elicit preference a lot through studying choices they make, right? So.
Excellent. Brett, and then Laura, and we'll break.
Just very quickly, I wanted to go back to, I guess, my last slide, because some of the, what I thought about
Were
was...
you asking for it actually to come up on the screen?
Sure, why not? But I think the point is, I think wherever we go, we have to understand what are the needs for this type of information, because I could design a study that gets lots and lots of really cool information that lots of people would be interested in. But then the question becomes, so what, to what use? And there are people who are charged with making significant decisions every day that impact individuals and policy. And that's what we need to understand is what's the need there. That's where we should be starting and say, how do we then develop the tools to be able to answer those questions?
Right. Always in the context of decision first and then coming back in the context. Yes. Excellent point. Laura, you get the last word before break.
Exciting. So as a data scientist, in order to help make some of those decisions that Brett just mentioned, up front for all this research work and as you're setting the agenda, put in data management and data standards. It is incredibly painful to backfit data standards. And so I recommend we learn from clinical trials and do that up front.
Yeah, as opposed to do it the way clinical trials has done it, I think.
And is still trying to, yes.
Yeah, okay. Great final point on the mechanics and the how, and that's also a research. What is the best data standards? Because there's lots of debate. That's why you get variety. What a fantastic group you've been, particularly right after lunch. Give yourself a round of applause. Get the blood moving.